a very warm welcome to our June forum, where we'll be looking into food systems. We'll be interrogating two studies or learning about them on food systems. One was done in the rural areas in Gokwe, the other was done in urban areas of Harare and Bulawayo. I think first up, can we call on Regina from WHH just to give some, we need the online people to see. Just to give us a few words about WHH's interest in food systems and how the study came about. And then Regina will introduce the presenter, Anna. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Very nice to see some colleagues in person actually again after such a long time. Very nice to be here. Yeah, my name is Regina Feind. I'm the country director for Welthungerhilfe, WHH, a German NGO. I think many of you know me as well. So our core mandate as an organization is food and nutrition security. And JA, or as we used to be called, WHH, we have been working on a new organization strategy, which was launched in last year. And food systems transformation was or is actually also in the center of our new organization strategy. We have been looking into food systems for the past few years, and we realized that this way of looking at food and nutrition security from this more holistic angle, which food systems approach of food systems thinking is offering makes so much more sense than what we did in the past. We realized that maybe in the past our focus was too narrow, while the food systems or the systems thinking in particular, and to understand how things are interrelated, how they influence each other or not, makes much more sense than, for example, also when you think about value chain approach, market linkage approach, which is very linear, whereas this systems approach is in a way a three-dimensional thing and considering a lot of things. So we had the opportunity here in Zimbabwe through also funds from our HQ to do a food systems analysis. This is actually following also the big food systems, UN Food Systems Conference last year, where we were also actively involved, that we thought, okay, we have now the kind of global food systems picture. There was, in preparation of this food system summit, was a country study, and I'm glad that Alex is here, who was also very much involved, and of course Anna Brazier was heavily involved. And we thought, we need to break this down now. We want to, we have the country context, the country food system for Zimbabwe. Let's look what is it actually at district level, where we work as an organization. We work very much at the grassroots level, and so we were keen to understand what is actually the food systems. And we selected Gokwe South and also Gokwe North, two districts in Midlands Province, because we have been working there for a very long time. We have been working there with different interventions in the past. Maybe the most, the biggest one recently was the LFSP program, which has come to an end last year. And but we have still a program ongoing, which is we realize it's actually very much a food systems project in a way. It's actually a social enterprise, but it's addressing a lot of areas which we identified in this study. Thank you very much, Anna. We were very happy to get you once again. Anna Brazier has been working actually with us also in various fields in the past, so this was actually quite helpful as well, since she knows a little bit what we are doing. Of course, she brings with her all the experience of working in being Zimbabwean, working here, having grown up, and having a good understanding also of what might come up, and you have the in-depth experience with the countrywide food system study, and I think this was really of good help. So I'm glad that you helped us with this study, and I think the outcomes are really interesting, and yeah, we hope to use these outcomes findings also for our future programming. Maybe I can add that what is planned, because I mean what we need to understand is a food system study is not an evaluation. Some of the findings might look like an evaluation, but it's not. The approach is completely different, and it was also not our intention to evaluate now what has been done there before, but we wanted, we had this genuine interest to understand the food system, and we are actually planning to do a post-implementation monitoring or post-implementation evaluation of the LFSP program in Gokwe. So this is planned for the probably third, maybe fourth quarter of this year, and I think these two studies then together will complement each other nicely and will give us more information of whether the interventions in the past were maybe not the right one or were the right one, and I think this is then together will help us even more for future planning. Thank you, and I think I need to hand over to Anne now. Is it? Or?
Great.
Thank you.
And from this circle.
It's like a bullseye or dartboard.
Afternoon, everyone. Those of you who were at the talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago will be very pleased to know that I've cut this down hugely, so it's hopefully much more punchy. So this, as Regina said, is the food system study that we did in Gokwe North, Gokwe South and Gokwe Urban. We use this framework, which is, as Alex will recognise, taken from the FAO conceptual framework for that we use in the National Food System Study. But we just took this template and applied it specifically to Gokwe. So we can go to the next slide. I'm not going to go through that, don't worry. So the study objectives, we were mapping the food system's actors, the direct actors and the regulators of the food system. We analysed the drivers of the food system and looked at the impacts. We wanted to understand the response of the Gokwe food system to influences such as policy, climate change, food loss, food waste, and food safety. And we wanted to propose indicators that could be used to measure the health of the food system. So that was the purpose. So the methodology, and this is also, I've adjusted this response to your two questions that were posed on the WhatsApp group. So we did a literature review, obviously. We did a stakeholder workshop which had 43 attendees. Then we did 23 key informant interviews. So we did key informant interviews at district level, and then we also interviewed stakeholders at ward level. We chose 2 wards in each district as sample wards, and these wards were former LFSP wards, so they had interventions already. And then we also did 2 focus groups. The focus groups we did, so we chose 2 wards. In each ward we did 2 focus groups, one with male participants and one with female participants. And we chose the wards in terms of wards that were closer to the urban centre and wards that were further away. So we were comparing remote and wards nearer to markets. And then in the urban area, we did 2 focus groups. So that was 10 focus groups altogether with a minimum of 8 participants in each focus group. Then we did market surveys. So in each of the sample wards, we visited shops, butcheries, restaurants, and produce markets. And then we also did a survey in Gokwe town to see the differences. Yeah, so that was the methodology. The findings, we first of all looked at the sort of contextual findings, and when we analysed the data, we didn't find really major differences between Gokwe North and Gokwe South. Gokwe North is hotter and drier. We know that it gets a lot less rainfall and it's further away from the centre, Gokwe Centre. So it has poorer transport networks. Gokwe South has a stronger administrative and transport network, and it's got better access to markets. Both districts have got about the same population, around 300,000 people. The town has got a population of about 30,000 people. And in terms of crop production, interestingly, even though Gokwe North is drier, more or less the same crops are produced in both districts. So in terms of field crops and horticultural crops and livestock, so it's more or less the same. Livestock ownership is very low in both districts. So in Gokwe South, 51%, and Gokwe North, 62% have no cattle at all. Other livestock is also pretty low, but that's typical situation in Zimbabwe these days. Gokwe North and Gokwe South have the lowest incomes of all districts in the Majingo province, Midlands province, according to the ZimVac. So in Gokwe North, the monthly average income is 26 US, and Gokwe South, the average income is 36, average monthly income, so pretty low. We did find that in remote wards, incomes were lower and prices in the shops were higher, so that wasn't a great surprise. So I have to emphasize here before we go on to the next slide, this was a qualitative study. Okay, so it's very generalized, it was very superficial, we were just trying to get a feel of the situation. So the results are people's perceptions of the food system, they're not a very accurate reflection of the food system. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. So in terms of the actors, the direct actors, there were no real surprises here. This could be anywhere in Zimbabwe, really. Farmers, collectors, in terms of wild produce collectors, processors, vendors, retailers, transporters, and middlemen, the dreaded middlemen that everyone loves to hate. In terms of women and children, they were mainly occupied in terms of farm labour. Horticultural produce was the main activity for women and children. Traditional legume production, women and children, and poultry production. Men were more involved with cash cropping, large livestock production, and heavy work in terms of ploughing and tree clearing. And young men were really vocally disinterested in agriculture. So the young men that we consulted were just, they don't want to have anything to do with agriculture. They're brick making, sand and gravel extraction, artisanal mining, which is very big in Gokwe, some cash cropping. So those who are forced to be involved with agriculture will go into cash cropping. Mainly horticulture. So horticulture is a big thing in Gokwe now. Gokwe was formerly a cotton-dominated area, but people are trying to move away from cotton production and getting into horticulture. So this seems to be the new big thing that everyone's trying to get involved with. Young men and women are also involved increasingly in wild fruit collection, so for commercial use and also for selling within the community and consumption. So in terms of regulators and influencers of the food system, it's the obvious ones: local authorities, government departments, parastatals, the GMB, very dominant force, traditional leaders at district and ward and village level, private sector, mainly retailers and contractors, then also buyers and transport companies, and then middlemen. So middlemen are usually individuals, slightly better educated people. They don't have to be male, they can be women as well. But these are people who identified an opportunity and they're mainly engaged in buying produce from farmers and bringing it to towns and selling it. Then NGOs and donors also have quite a big influence in Gokwe. There are quite a number of different NGOs. The overarching characteristic of a lot of these regulators and influencers, particularly the government ones, is that their capacity was weak, and this was something that they identified themselves. They lacked resources, and they're not monitoring the food system at all. They're not involved with monitoring natural resource use, they're not involved with monitoring agriculture, they're not involved with monitoring markets or any of those kinds of things. They just don't have the resources to do that. And corruption and exploitation was mentioned, but not hugely. So this was not directly spoken about. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so looking at production and collection. So remember, collection means wild food collection because that is a significant part of the Gokwe food system. The natural resource base, this is our findings. So the natural resource base is very stressed and degraded. there's a huge pressure on land in Gokwe. There's a high population and people really seem to be struggling to access land. There are large farmers who have large pieces of land, and there are some farmers who have very tiny pieces of land. And those farmers who have less land are usually working as sharecroppers or as labour piecework for the larger landowners. There's pollution of soil, water and air. There's very weak governance of natural resources in terms of government departments that are supposed to be in charge, but also the local traditional leaders were accused of being very weak, corrupt and not doing their job generally. And then these problems are exacerbated by climate change. There's lack of finance. So we've already seen that the incomes are very low. There's a lack of cash for individual farmers to invest in their farming. So it's almost a cash-free economy. And we'll see that later on when we look at the markets aspects. There's a lack of labour and time. So that's a really major factor. Women bear the brunt, as we saw in the previous slide, for the labour. And they really don't have time to do everything. Their time is being stretched further and further. And this is a very major influence on the food system. The youth are really disinterested in agriculture. And where young people in a family, in a household, used to be labour that women could rely on, they're no longer available. So it's a problem. So all of those things lead to lower yields. And this is something that people say time and time and again. Yields are declining, yields are declining. And this is what the Zimbabwe and other studies are also showing. We're also doing another study in Gokwe. We've just finished another study in Gokwe, which is looking at agroecological methods that were introduced through the LFSP. And low yields came up again and again. So degraded soils, and that means people are becoming more and more dependent on expensive inputs. Pests and diseases are increasingly a problem for both crop and livestock farmers. Droughts, dry spells, water shortages. Farmers say they don't have the knowledge to deal with these problems, particularly related to soil management and climate change. The choice of crops is poor, and this is what the extension officers were saying. People are trying to grow crops that are not appropriate for the area. So there's a focus on cash cropping rather than cropping for food, and production is very much driven by markets. So farmers will look at what the market demands and they will grow according to that rather than growing according to the environmental conditions in the area and their labour means. This is leading to less affordable, less diverse, less nutritious food available locally, and it's increasingly degrading the natural resource base on which agriculture depends. Okay, move to the next one. So this is taken from the Zimbabwe, and it just gives you an overview of the main crops that are produced in the two districts. So Gokwe North is the pink stripe, so I don't know if you'd call that orange or pink or whatever. Gokwe South is the yellow, and the black is the Midlands province. So you can see that, interestingly, Gokwe North, if we trust the Zimbabwe data, a lot of people have said to me, oh, you don't bother to listen to the Zimbabwe, do you? Okay, if we trust the Zimbabwe data, then Gokwe North is producing more than Gokwe South, which is interesting because Gokwe North has lower rainfall. Gokwe North is also a very maize-dominated area, according to this chart. And if you ask agronomists, they'll say that maize is really not appropriate for that environment in terms of rainfall, in terms of soils. Much less of the small grains are grown, and small grains would be much more appropriate. Sorghum is grown to some extent, but the millets are barely grown at all, according to this. And yeah, the other crops, they didn't look at horticultural crops in this, but just an interesting graph to set us off. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so moving on to processing and storage, looking at the drivers and impacts of the food system. There's a lack of processing and storage sites. The facilities are poor. The equipment people are using is not appropriate. It's not saving labour. There's a real problem with energy. So if people are using grinding mills and husking and threshing machines, if they're diesel or electric, it's a disaster because fuel is a big problem. Also, any processing that involves water is a problem because there's no water, there's a big shortage of water. People lack expertise in proper storage and processing. And there are very few locally based enterprises. So there are very few processing centres in the growth points or in the rural areas or even in the town. These Gokwe North and Gokwe South are places where people produce food and it gets shipped out. If they do processing, it's mainly processed at home by the family. So there's very little value addition. Processing is very labour intensive. There are high losses. So the extension officers that we spoke to said that on average 10 to 15% of most crops are just lost through contamination, through pest attack, whatever, they're losing it. And for cowpeas, it's up to 60%. So that's a huge amount of loss for cowpeas. And that actually puts people off growing cowpeas because they know they're going to lose so much. There's the outcome of that, the impact of that is less safe, less diverse, less convenient food because it's not value added, there's not much processing, it's less convenient for families. And there's less local food available. Go to the next slide. So marketing and transport drivers and impacts, this is probably the slide that will introduce you the most. There's a huge amount of barter trade and commodity wages in Gokwe North and South. This means people have kind of given up on cash. Cash is a total waste of time for most people. So when we looked at those very low incomes, that part of that is because people are just no longer using cash. They're using other means of exchange. We talked to people in shops who said that even in Gokwe town, people will come with a bag of grain or even a goat and try and exchange that for goods. And often the shop will accept that quite happily. So it then poses a problem for the shop because then the shop has to try and find US dollars to purchase new stock. So there's a huge amount of exchange between goods and RTGS and Rand and US dollars, and it's an incredibly complex economy. GMB issues, I'm not even going to scratch the surface because I think everyone knows what the issues with the GMB are, but everyone complained about them in Gokwe. There's low demand for local nutritious food. So in the shops that we visited and surveyed, not the markets, obviously the marketplaces, it was all local food, but in the shops, there was almost no local food available to buy. So if you walk into a little grocery store in the growth points, or even in Gokwe town, almost everything is imported. You can hardly buy any local produce at all. People complain that they don't have access to reliable markets, and that impacts on what they grow. The lack of market price and demand information is really big, so farmers don't know what the market wants. They don't know how much things really cost, and this means they get ripped off by the middlemen. The transport networks are very poor. The market facilities are very poor. So where the local authorities have established markets, there's no water, there are no toilets, there's no waste disposal. The actual stalls that people are expected to use are falling apart. They don't protect them from the wind and the rain and all that stuff. Farmer groups are not organised well enough, so that this also puts them open to being exploited by the middlemen. And there's very low investment in local enterprises and local infrastructure, which you've already mentioned. So this leads to few reliable local markets, and that makes everyone want to get their product out of Gokwe. They want to send it to Kwekwe, they want to send it to Bulawayo, they want to send it to Harare. Exploitation by middlemen, flooding of the market. So because people don't know what to grow, they produce the wrong crops at the same time, and everyone's suddenly trying to sell tomatoes, and there's no market for it. Sweet potatoes at the moment, I think, is the huge glut. People have very low incomes, so they have less money to buy food. There are very few local products in the shops. Few nutritious products are available. So also when we surveyed the shops, there's very little that's nutritious that you can buy. And people don't seem to have a demand for, they don't seem to want to buy those things. They want to go buy the little packet of biscuits from South Africa or the cordial or the processed food. That's what people usually want when they go into these little shops. The local economy is very, very weak. So everything that's produced in Gokwe is either consumed by the household or it's shipped out of Gokwe. This leads to less local, diverse, convenient, nutritious food that's available or affordable, and a very weak local economy. Okay, we can move on to the last section, which is looking at consumption. So this is taken from the ZimVac, and I really hope these figures are wrong. The critics of the ZimVac, I hope you're right, because if they're correct, then it shows a pretty scary situation in Gokwe South, which is supposed to be the more affluent district, the district that has better rainfall, the district that's closer to markets. So if we look there at those figures that are highlighted in red, we see that for children under 5, minimum meal frequency for the children surveyed in Gokwe South was only 7% of those children were receiving the right number of meals, and 0% were receiving a minimum acceptable diet. So it's a really scary situation, and this is really, to me, links to our study when we were saying that malnutrition and food security, it's more complex than we think. Because Gokwe South is an agricultural producing area where everyone's a farmer, everyone's growing food. And if you drive through Gokwe, you go to Bomba Market, it's absolutely full of food, but people are not getting that food. So it's not about, you can't solve this problem by getting people to grow more food. It's not going to happen. It's much more complicated than that. In our survey, we also found a big difference in the types of food that people ate according to their wealth group. Okay, that's not a big surprise, but it's something that the ZimVac really doesn't bring out. And it's something that needs to be investigated much more carefully with a quantitative study at household survey. So we found that most households in the middle and poor wealth groups eat only 2 meals a day. Children in most households are eating the same frequency as adults. So even young children under 5 are eating the same number of meals as adults, which is very scary. And the reason we were told for this to happen is because women are so time stressed that they don't have time to feed their children, because they are so involved with agricultural activities, particularly during the growing season, that they don't have time to give their kids the right number of meals. The poor, interestingly, were getting a really good diet if you looked at what people said in the focus group. So the poor were eating a very wide range of nutritious foods. They were eating more traditional food, they were eating more wild food, but the amount of food that they were getting was much lower. So the rich were eating absolute rubbish, bought food, processed food, far too much cooking oil, far too much sugar, far too much meat. But don't forget, this was people's perceptions. It wasn't a quantitative study, so we weren't actually getting figures. We were just getting people's perceptions. And if you ask me what people in Borodale anticipate to eat, I will also make a fantastic, fantasy about steaks and things like that every night. But this is something that the ZimVac has continuously also exposed. The urban diet was similar to the rural diet, but more purchased food and more processed food, but not huge differences between urban and rural. Next slide, we're nearly finished. Okay, so the reasons for this situation were identified as lack of nutritional knowledge, food preferences, so people prefer to eat maize, they don't want to eat the small grains, and yet maize doesn't grow very well, so yields are much lower. Youth definitely don't like traditional food, lack of income to buy food, focus on cash cropping and selling, poor food safety, so many people identified lack of hygiene in food preparation and production, and then the fact that women don't have time to access and prepare nutritious food, so this came up. The choice of food bought and eaten is dictated by affordability, accessibility, attitudes, and seasonal availability. Well, that's no surprise. And the drivers of food purchases are quality, safety, so trust in the brand. And what people said when we asked them, why don't you stock local foods? When we asked the shopkeepers, they said, because our customers don't trust local food. They don't believe that it's the same quality. They don't believe it's good enough quality. And packaging, people are very drawn to foreign packaging. This is why they like to buy imported food. They're attracted by the advertising and the branding. So this leads to diets lacking in diversity and supplying inadequate amounts. And the diets of the rich are very high in processed foods, which I think will lead on to what Percy's going to say about the urban study in a minute. So we came up with some recommendations. I think a lot of them are very obvious, and we're still exploring. So these are just very general. Better natural resource governance and land management practices. So this ties in very nicely with the study we've just done about the agroecological techniques. And it does, our agroecological technique study shows that people in Gokwe are very concerned about this issue and they really want to do something about it. We need better synergies between NGOs and government departments. I think that one's really a tired statement that everyone puts in every report. Better grazing planning and management. So there's a huge competition about land, which we mentioned already, particularly between grazing land and cropping land. And this is one of the reasons that Fumbudza, interestingly, was so popular in Gokwe among our respondents, because they said that Fumbudza freed up grazing land. And it's obviously a really serious problem for people who do actually own, the few people who do own livestock. Encouraging diversification, seed saving, resilient local varieties, more of that needs to happen. Storage, production, and processing and marketing groups need to be linked to ISOLs. Well, that's already happening, but just more. More labour-saving technologies. This could be a real game changer because women do not have time to feed their families. So this should be a real focus, and it's a difficult one because it's expensive. And you can't give individuals labour-saving technologies, really. So it has to be linked to groups. Gender interventions, because women are really struggling and they're not being supported by communities and men. And then using social behaviour change methods in interventions. So not just in nutrition interventions, but in agricultural interventions. In all food system interventions, it's not just about training, it's about behaviour change. That's the important thing. Okay, we can quickly go to the next one. I think all these are probably obvious, and maybe I shouldn't, because am I eating into Percy's time? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so shall I just, you can look at the recommendations, but basically it's just the obvious ones. Better technology, commodity groups, development of local markets. Okay, maybe this is a real highlighter for the market and transport, is stop focusing on getting people linked to national markets. First of all, we've got to build the local market. That's a real crucial one. And yeah, consumption, just keep doing more of the same, but care groups seem to be working, so focusing on care groups, and it's a national approach that people support. Okay, final word, the Gokwe food system is producing a wide range of nutritious foods, but this is not reaching most consumers and is not contributing to local economic growth, and it's severely degrading the natural resource base. So on those three counts, it fails.
Thank you, Anna. Gigi, would you like to come up and just say a few words about this before Percy gives the presentation?
How many minutes?
Gigi.
Right. Am I standing in the right place? It's probably filming my chest because I'm tall. But anyway.
Stand back.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gigi from Hivos. I'm a climate justice business development manager working with our offices around Africa. In Southern Africa, our focus is Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi. So we've been working on food systems for about 6 years, 7 years. We also host the RUAF Global Partnership on Urban Agriculture and Sustainable Food Systems. So we pull in quite a lot of expertise from around the world. So, you know, climate justice, we think rights, and so that's for us, our particular interest in food systems is on the governance aspect, because we need citizens more involved in setting an agenda in our food system that works for people and planet, because currently it's clearly not. We all know it's actually the food system is the #1 killer of people, NCDs, and unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, by 2030, WHO says we'll be the same. our food is our biggest killer, so it does amaze me why all our health programs are not focusing more on that. But anyway, so what we did in Zimbabwe, we piloted in the past 12 months a one-year program with support from UNICEF, bringing in some food system thinking into Harare and Bulawayo. And that's one thing we've learned from our work. Yes, you need national perspective, a city or a district or a province. And really, then you're looking at the local food system and you can really try and strengthen that within a territory. So what we did, our sort of two main objectives. The first one was on increasing the understanding of our food system. What's the food system? Who's involved? Who are they? We'll be sharing. MDP was our research partner. And so Percy will go more into that. And then secondly, it was the objective around governance. And so then we set up a multi-stakeholder platform with a big focus on youth participation. We're focused on this, a wide range of stakeholders, particularly the Department of Planning, and we're very interested and engaged. So, so then the idea of these multi-stakeholder platforms, you go on a learning journey together, you understand your city's food system, where is the opportunity, what are the priority issues we want to address, and then eventually over time you will ideally develop a city food manifesto or a city food policy, which is the direction we've been taking in other cities, like Lusaka. So, I'll just say one thing. So, we want to see systemic change, obviously, not even 5 years maybe. But what we try to do in this pilot is just lay some foundations for it and to raise some awareness. So, I will thank you very much. I'll hand to Percy.
Thank you. I feel a bit uncomfortable. I left formal employment some 12 years ago. So dressing like this place and very uncomfortable. Now I spend most of my time either or teaching in the university, so this is not quite my space. But I was in a meeting where I was supposed to dress like this because I was meeting with government officials. I would like to share with you findings of the research that we did as part of the project described by Gigi. The research was a very interesting research. The methodology that we used was very engaging in that we would be doing desk studies, key informant interviews, but also alongside. And so almost like what we were doing was being validated. So I will quickly run through it. It was a fairly comprehensive research, but I'll quickly run through it in the next 15 minutes. So if we can proceed now. So these are the partners. For instance, South Africa has always done a lot of food systems work, but we're really grateful that these two partners enabled us to then do this work. A food systems approach is not common in this country. People would work in the area of food, either focusing on production, on processing, but very few studies have been comprehensive enough to bring everything together. So we were really excited that this gave us an opportunity to do that. Next time. So this study is significant for two reasons. I am a scholar in cities. There is rapid population growth, and many of you will know that in 2008, the world reached what is called a tipping point, where for the first time, more people now live in cities than in rural areas. So this is significant. But more importantly, in our region, this is significant because there is chronic food insecurity in many cities across the SADC region. I was involved in an AFSAN study which showed that up to 90% of residents in poor neighborhoods are not getting good nutrition, are not getting sufficient food, And therefore we have a serious problem of food security in our cities. And yet, I just indicated that this is where our growth is. The future is urban. Next slide. So I did say a bit about the methodology, key informant interviews, a lot of desk studies looking into the laws, the regulations, what do they say about food and food systems in urban areas. And then the second part was actually case studies, where we had 2 case studies in Harare, in another 2 case studies in Bulawayo. One in a poor area, one in a rich neighborhood in both cities. And then we did a lot of GIS mapping of food systems infrastructure. So the background is there is rapid urbanization globally, but more so in the sub-Saharan region. They actually say 90% of all new urbanization is happening in our region. Unfortunately, whereas historically urbanization translated to better living conditions in our region, there is a lot of urbanization of very poor people with no employment, with poor housing, with poor infrastructure. So we're really seeing a lot of urbanization of poverty. So we have a lot of problems. Then coming to what we were looking at in terms of how people are living in Harare and Bulawayo, there is a disproportionately high expenditure on food. This is really because incomes are very low. So a lot of, much of the incomes are being spent on food. For example, and unfortunately the situation is deteriorating. You will find that in 2019, 43% of the incomes in Bulawayo were going to food. In 2020, it was up to 57%. And this is the trend in almost all urban areas in the country. Let's go on. So both cities have a youthful population, very high prevalence of child-headed households. And then, unfortunately, most households enjoy very poor diets, very poor dietary diversity. So when you analyze their diets, there is so much of starches, oils, sugars, but very little of what is nutritious, proteins, and so on. So when you analyze their diets, very poor from a dietary diversity perspective. Harare environmentally enjoys better climate, better rainfall, but the urban food production is very poorly organized. The city council is not as engaging with the public, and therefore very little food production goes on in Harare in an organized manner. Bulawayo, on the other hand, not so much rain, not so conducive to food production, but very well organized. The city council and the public are very, engaged. They are food gardens. So production in Bulawayo happens in spaces that are actually authorized and planned. In Harare, there is a lot of illegal practice of in the area of food production. Then a general overview of the urban food systems. About 30% of food, mainly vegetables, are grown within the city region food, the city region. And by the city region, I really mean if it's in Harare, it's Harare and its environs. So it would include a bit of Loboshawa, Seke, and so on. So you get up to 30% of the food coming from those areas. So when you look at the city, there is a general widespread provision of food infrastructure, shopping centers, food buckets, and so on. But if you look deeper into it, you still see that there is what are called food deserts. This is a fairly new concept where it actually refers to the prevalence of areas of lack of food, even within an area where there's some provision. For example, here in Harare, if you go to the new areas, which are generally unplanned in Harare South, you find there are people there with no shopping centers or with a high prevalence of informal shopping centers. So they are not as provided with food, even in terms of just having market access. So informal markets are abundant, particularly in the poor areas, but they are very fragile. They are not recognized at law. And then fast food outlets, they are growing rapidly. one of the fast food companies indicated that in this year alone, they are establishing 92 new outlets. So the people that are advocating for good food are clearly losing it when you compare with the fast foods. And then a growing phenomenon in both Harare and Bulawayo is that many people are relying on remittances of either food or cash for food. Many people in this country now have their colleagues, their relatives that are based out of the country, whether in South Africa, in the UK, in Canada. And we found up to 30% of the households that we interviewed receive remittances that they then use either to buy food or they actually receive food from South Africa. I'll show you a picture. And then we did extensive mapping of the following aspects. Just quickly go through the different maps that we went through. For example, map number 1, we're showing shopping centers in Harare. You can see that there is a generally widespread provision of shopping centers. We were using this as a proxy to say, do people have access to areas where they can buy food? But you'll find these faint dots in the southern areas. This is the southern boundary of Harare. There are a lot of these faint, which are informal shopping areas, where they are developing those settlements which are not quite formal, which are not well serviced. Let's go to the next one. This is Bulawayo. Again, around the built-up area, a lot of shopping centers. So you could say people have access to food, but of course this is not enough. Let's go on to the next one. And then fast foods. This is Harare, fast foods. Expanding very fast, so much concentrated in the CBD and also in this northern part of the city, not so much in the southern low-income areas, because these people are looking for affordability. They are looking for markets where people can pay for their fast foods. Let's go on to the next one. This was mapping different types of food outlets in Bulawayo. The green ones, caravans are very popular, mobile food caravans in Bulawayo. And then there's also fast foods, the red ones. And then the blue ones were quite interesting. These are traditional, new restaurants. Traditional restaurants are getting fashionable. Unfortunately, traditional food outlets, which are selling very good, nutritious food, are very expensive. They're out of reach for most people. Next one. Then in Harare, we also mapped cultural food restaurants. Again, these are fairly good restaurants. Either they will be Greek, Italian, African, whatever it is. So we also mapped them. They generally, again, in the high income areas, not so many in the low income areas. Next one. Fresh produce markets, where you get your vegetables, green supplies, and so on. Fairly widespread. The green ones are the municipal markets, but the blue ones are the private markets. We now have your Aspindale, your Pomona market, and so on. Those are the private markets that are also coming up. Not so many of them as of now, but we found that they are actually closing in on a gap, because there isn't as many fresh produce markets as would be adequate for people in the city. Next one. So then we come to governance and policy framework. There are many laws that govern food. The Shop Licenses Act, the Regional Town and Country Plan, and so on. But the problem with these laws is most of these laws, even newer versions of these laws, are essentially all very old laws that have not been reviewed to reflect today's reality. So you find most of them. That's why they generally criminalize the operations of the informal sector, because the informal sector was not as prevalent in the past. And now, because it's dominating as the formal economy has collapsed, so sadly, they've not captured that. So the informal and small-scale sector is particularly affected by these laws. And then, although there are several institutions that deal with food, your Food and Nutrition Council, your Ministry of Health, and so on, they are not as visible on the ground. Talking to community leaders and so on, say, do you know Food and Nutrition Council? Do you know this? They don't know those institutions. So I know they are doing a lot of good work, but what we got, the feedback is on the ground, they are not felt as much. And then food institutions in this country are mainly government related and not community based. I spent some time in Canada myself, in Toronto. The Toronto Food Policy Council is more active on food matters than government institutions. They even receive support from government, but it's very much community driven. This is ideal because it allows communities to speak to what they want to eat. So this, unfortunately, is a huge gap in this country. Sadly, town planners, and I'm sad about this because I am one, in Harare, they do not believe they have anything to do with food. Although they plan for everything, they, in their responses, say we have nothing to do with food. It's not our responsibility. So you can understand what happens when food blind planners are planning. It means they are not thinking at all about what the communities that they're planning for, where they get their food, what type of food they should have access to, and so on. So this is one area where there is really need for intervention. And then Bulawayo is doing a lot better. They have an urban agriculture policy, a food policy, they have a stakeholder forum, and they're working closely with communities. There is less council people conflicts with informality in Bulawayo because of that engagement. Harare does not engage as much. Sadly, it also reflects in the conflicts that you see, particularly in CBD. Next slide. So, the rich, generally, we were also interested, where do people get food? The rich are flexible. They can drive to wherever the food is. But in poor communities, people get food locally. So it is important that food systems in poor communities are sound and makes food available at affordable rates to people because they cannot go and get it anywhere else. So up to 90% of respondents in poor areas said they got their food from informal sources. And unfortunately, as I indicated, the law criminalizes most of these informal sources. Looking into Buliriro, for example, in Harare here, although meat is very strictly regulated itself, but we found that after hours, people bring meat on the streets and are selling it right on the streets. Yeah? I've already talked about the remittances. Let's proceed. So this is how food is coming from South Africa. That will be a combi, a minibus. It will be drawing a trailer loaded almost up to the rafters with food. And then this gets to a place where everyone has been told it will arrive at this place at this time, and it's only opened when everyone is there that is going to receive their food. A very well coordinated but informal food remittance system. And this applies now. It used to be very common in Bulawayo only, but now it's also quite prevalent here. If you go to high-grade shopping center in Woodinville and so on, daily there will be buses and truckloads bringing in food from people in South Africa that are buying it for their relatives in this country. Next slide. So we also tried to map where is the food in Harare coming from. So this was trying to quantify where it's coming from. We did identify where the different food sources are coming from, but unfortunately there is still a gap in that this does not have quantities. And we feel that for future research, people want to actually say, are we meeting all the banana requirements from Bema Valley, or some of them are coming from South Africa, and what are the comparative quantities? So we did indicate where it's coming from, but this is not in quantities. Next slide. So what is influencing food choices? So availability in the markets, convenience, particularly in low-income areas, affordability. In low-income areas, they generally just consume things that they can afford. And then parents, in particular mothers, do influence what is eaten in the household. And then ease of preparation. This was common in tertiary institutions. There is a very high consumption of noodles. Very poor nutrition, but this is what they do because it's easy to prepare. In the next 3 minutes, their meal is ready and they're eating it. But very poor nutrition. And then, of course, what you know is important. Many young people were complaining that some of the nutritious food that you referred to we don't eat it because we don't know how to prepare it. You know, even some of them were saying even our parents can't prepare sadza out of rapoko or finger millet and so on. And then what is fashionable and tasty? They said, no, fast food outlets are like our social spaces. That's where we meet and then. So when we are there, it's fashionable to eat there. You know? So maybe we want to think about other social places that also serve better food. And then although almost everyone mentioned health considerations in food, but in practice, very few people actually do that when they eat. They will eat very sugary foods, but they will tell you they understand the health importance of not eating the sugary foods. Next slide. So what is working and what is not working? What is working is that every household that we visited, for people that own their plots, they are growing something in their backyard. This is really positive. Almost everyone who has space has a mindset that they should be growing something. Unfortunately, they are all growing leaf vegetables only. There is no variety in terms of what they are growing. So maybe for people that are intervening in terms of programming, in terms of capacity building for production, they should consider how to address that. There is food in most areas, unlike in the past, for example, in 2008, where we did studies in Harare and found that food was really not available. Currently, food is generally available, although not affordable. There is government support, council support in Bulawayo for food production. So again, it's something that we should ride on. And then there are many organizations working in the area of food, many. And then what is not working? There are no community-led initiatives, particularly in Harare. Most initiatives are top-down, coming from government. Then there's also sometimes disharmony between policy and practice. For example, all municipalities in this country in 1993 met in Nyanga and came up with the Nyanga Declaration on Agriculture, and we're going to then facilitate for it, plan for it, and so on. But only Bulawayo is actually doing something about it. The rest will only talk about it, but they're not doing anything. Then there's little collaboration between city and informal food suppliers. Yet we have indicated that up to 90% of some communities source their food from informal food suppliers. Next slide. The youth, the challenges that are facing poverty, most of their parents cannot give them money or cannot buy the food to meet their nutritional needs, limited availability of healthy options and places that they hang out, and then most healthy food restaurants and nutritious foods are very expensive, and then, very importantly, poor presentation of some healthy foods. When you walk into any place where food is sold, junk food is very well presented. Meanwhile, good food is never well presented. So the youth complained about that. Next slide. So I have talked about policy and so on, so maybe I can skip this one. Any differences targeting in terms of special groups? Mothers tend to be more involved in food choices than other people in the household. And then, unfortunately, there is very little to no gender or special focus interest in urban food systems. Only in Bulawayo, we visited Jairus Jiri trying to do something to address food systems for the disabled, but generally there was no programming that is targeted at special interest groups. I think I'm coming to the end. Proposed solutions from the youths, raising of awareness, improving packaging and presentation of good healthy food, and then also teach us how to prepare good nutritional food. Next slide. This is lacking the preparation, the packaging of good traditional and other nutritious foods into nice packages. You don't find this generally. We were very refreshed to find these young people in Bulawayo who have opened up a factory where they are just specializing on nice traditional nutritional food, packaging it in nice packages, and then distributing it to supermarkets. Next slide. So what are the proposed policy and action areas? Awareness raising on healthy nutritious food. This is important. Improving packaging and presentation, legal reform, I did indicate that although 90%, up to 90% in some communities get their food from informal sources, these are all illegal sources. And then raising planners' awareness. We cannot have planners who are blind to food matters. Everyone eats food. So you cannot have such an important subject not being considered by critical professionals who are determining where we build, what we build, how we build it, where we live, and so on. So planners are really critical. And then building a healthy relationship between parents and children on food and nutrition issues. Lastly, I think areas for further research, these are indicated there. Thank you very much.
Percy, you may as well stay down there. Sorry, everyone, our timing is a bit of a disaster today. So I do hope that you will talk the afternoon off, because we definitely won't finish before 4, I don't think. And the scheduled time is to be taken. If you need to leave, don't be sorry. Okay, I'd like to, thanks Percy, grab a seat. I need Anna down there. So you know Percy and Anna, maybe you don't know Jane. Jane Stack, currently with the Resilience Knowledge Hub and an expert in resilience. Would you like to come down, Jane? And then Alex Carr, currently with FAO, who is part of the National Food System Study. So what we have, this is going to be the facilitator of a panel discussion. We're just going to sort of interrogate the surveys and have a really good discussion. So Alex, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you to the presenters, and hi, Jane, again.
Hi.
Long time. I think we were very lucky to have the two different perspectives, one from the rural area, one from the urban area. So I've just got I'm going to pose a few questions. Not to interrogate you too much, don't worry, Anna. You look terrified.
Go for it. I'm ready.
But I'll just go a few questions, and then I think, Michael, we're going to go to the floor for some other things, but hopefully we can have a reasonable discussion. So listening to the two different studies, I was really struck by the similarity of the issues in the food systems. You spoke about the consumption of unhealthy foods, fatty foods, and foods without protein. It was the same in both places, and also the lack of demand for healthy foods. And I was going to ask you, why do you think that's the case, and how is it possible that the context is so different and yet the food systems issues are so similar? I don't know if you can say something about that.
I mean, it's global, isn't it? Mm-hmm. This is a global phenomenon that's happening worldwide, is that people have preference for unhealthy processed food, but it's also convenience. That people don't have as much time as they used to for preparing food. They're very, very busy. And the most convenient food, unfortunately, tends to be less healthy. So, I mean, that's my perception.
Yeah. And our observation is also that availability of good food tends to be an issue, particularly in urban areas. You find that most healthy food options are also, for me, traditional food options. And generally, these have not been very industrialized. And so they are driven a lot more by the informal market. But because of the fragility of the informal sector, it then also means that option is not always there. When I used to work in CBD here in Harare, one of the foodstuffs that I really wanted was pumpkin leaves. So, and I would exclusively buy them from the informal sector. So the guy who was downstairs on the street who supplied them, I wouldn't see them maybe for a week or so. And then when I finally meet them, I would ask them why they were not there. and they would say the police, the municipality, you know, it's sometimes it's so difficult to a point where they can tactically withdraw for a while. And then, of course, they always then come back. So it's also the issue of availability. That's why for me, planning for such is critical, considering the different needs of the different groups, particularly from this health perspective, would really help, because then it means our planners are also creating markets which will make it not only certain for me, because it's now legal, but also convenient, and also the business of the person who's conducting it is also guaranteed. But at the moment, that is not the case.
So you say lack of availability, and maybe that's, I would say that's perhaps the case in the urban areas. But Anna, you said in Gokwe, and your closing slide, that healthy food options are available. So what's going on?
So I think that they're available, but for the majority of people, they're not affordable. So although there's a lot of horticultural produce produced in Gokwe, and we know that fruit and vegetables are very nutritious and very healthy, the people who are growing the fruit and vegetables want to sell them to Harare or Kwekwe or Bulawayo. So the prices are not conducive to the majority of people in Gokwe. What there is a lot of in Gokwe is wild foods and traditional vegetables that people grow, but it's all perception, because people see them as poverty foods. And that's why I said that it's not about training, it's not about educating people, it's about changing people's behavior. And that's much harder. We can educate people till the cows come home. And you said people know what's healthy, but they don't eat it. And it's not Zimbabwe, it's not Gokwe, it's global. That's the phenomenon all over the world. And it's just humans are weird. What can you do? You know, there are ways of changing it, but I don't think continuously educating people is really the right way.
Okay.
And this consideration of some healthy traditional foods as poor man's food is really very prevalent. You know, I have friends who, when we go to a traditional restaurant, they will not eat okra, they will not eat certain, because they will say, it reminds me of the time when I was very poor. And we are saying to him, you know, this is really what is good for you, but they will tell you, this reminds me of the poverty days. And these are guys who think they've now made it, but they don't realize that what they now look down upon is really what they should be. Yeah.
Okay. Jane, do you want to say anything about the
well, I was.
the
I
wider
mean,
issues or the sampling size?
Well, I was just saying, I work quite close to the university, and every time I park at Bridge Spa, I see the university students walking out with a sliced loaf of bread and an energy drink.
Yeah.
That is basically their food for at least one meal, or if not 2 meals a day. So I'm sure a lot of it is the lack of convenient, nutritious food. So a lot of this, I mean, I think from yours, a lot of this is an agribusiness issue, or that should be where the focus is. If there's some way of getting collaboration or more collaboration between, public and private sector over the processing and making attractive convenience foods. I mean, even buying a tin of beans is expensive at the moment because most of it's imported. I mean, that's a very nutritious food, but students are not buying it because it's cheaper. Rather than paying $2 for a tin of beans, they can get a loaf of bread and a energy drink. So I think a lot of it is the lack of alternatives on the market when you don't have time. I mean, I think one of the issues I was going to raise for both of the studies, I mean, I know you mentioned the sampling sizes, but in many ways, these qualitative studies are very rich. And, you know, you referred a lot to the ZimVac studies. So you've also drawn on the quantitative stuff, and now it's trying to get that richness of the qualitative side. And, you know, there's a lot of things which the quantitative study doesn't show you in terms of different income groups, choosing different types of food. So, I mean, I'm not so worried as you were in terms of the.
No,
Oh, okay. I wasn't.
You're a
I wasn't
statistician,
so,
that's why.
I've moved much more towards qualitative data collection.
You're older.
Just because it just puts some flesh on the issues. And the other thing, which I don't think you mentioned enough of in the urban study, was the energy issue.
Yeah.
When it comes down to women preparing food, I mean, it's not surprising they only do one meal a day. And then the rest is just snacks or leftovers and it's the same for processing.
Yeah.
There's no energy or reliable energy in rural areas for the processing. So unless we solve the energy issues in rural and urban areas, it's very difficult to solve some of the processing and value addition in urban and rural areas.
Yeah. And I can say a bit about the energy food, link. I did some studies in Epworth, another ultra low income area, and we found that there's a lot of innovation now going on around energy issues. So people pre-cook beans and then sell them as pre-cooked, because the people that would buy them ordinarily would shun them because they take too long to cook. So now we have people who are selling pre-cooked beans, packaged in very tiny packages, just enough for the meal.
It's brilliant. That's what we need. They've solved it.
But obviously it's fragile because you're the people who are breaking the regulations. So I mean that's obviously a big issue in urban areas, is having the regulations come up to date with the sort of food system.
There's a huge disconnect between the lived reality of the people and what the regulations say. There is a huge disconnect.
Okay, I mean, I'm changing the argument a little bit, the focus, looking at how we can transform the current food systems. Personally, you mentioned the need for community-driven a change. And I think, Anna, you said that for many years. How, I mean, as designers of projects and programs, how can we do that? How can we go about that? Getting much more community participation and to drive that change and drive that demand for better food products.
I would think we need to stimulate interest in the subject. Come up with musical fairs combined with food fairs where people can then maybe showcase traditional, nutritious food, trying to change the narrative using what people are already interested in. Because when the youth refer to fast food outlets as their social spaces, then we need to create alternative social spaces, but which are positive. And I'm thinking we could have these traditional food fairs, but then bring in their musicians that the youths would love to see, but at a good function, where you are then influencing them in a positive way. It's one way.
Yeah, I think that youth thing is key. I mean, people say over and over again, like a broken record, young people are not interested in agriculture. Okay, that's fine. They don't have to be interested in agriculture because there are lots of other places in the food system where they can fit in. And I mean, one thing the research team on our study said is, why don't we get the youth to be the real front line of promoting the change? Why don't we make them the change makers? Why don't we put them in charge of developing a campaign, developing the medium that we use to promote the information? So give them a really crucial role, because the last thing young people want to do is listen to boring old people talk about eating finger millet. They're not interested in that. But if you give young people a role to say, right,
or
you
NGO
guys,
staff.
you guys come up with the convenience food, set up a business, develop an innovation. I mean, there are people in Harare doing that. There's the Innovation Hub, which has just given Tracy Mapfumo an award. She's taken local ingredients, she's developed snacks, which are very healthy, and she's winning awards left, right, and centre for what she's doing. She's doing exactly what we need people to be doing. in urban and in rural areas. But it's also got to be linked to money. It's not just about behavior. People do things if they can make money out of them.
Yeah.
So we've just got to find a way of making it money generating.
Yeah. Our project was youth focused, and at the end, a few groups were selected to do pilots. And some of the pilots have since been commercialized. And these were pilots specifically on healthy foods. Some of them have since been commercialized. One of the groups, I think the group at Evelyn High School in Bulawayo, has even gone international. I think they've won a competition, and now they've been entered into an international one where they are promoting their nutritious foods, which they've started and now they are commercializing. So it can happen, but I think it takes deliberate effort. It takes community mobilization and so on.
So I think you've really hit on something important, and I think, you know, as programmers and designers, we've been ignoring, I think, the youth in our design, and I think it's now time that we really do need to listen to them and be innovative, and perhaps being a bit more fashionable and bringing in things like, you know, rock stars or pop stars, whatever, rather than focusing on production. We need to focus on some of these other funny things, you know, and really try and bring in some innovation and make it fashionable. Because you're quite right. I think focusing on some of the messages we put forward are a bit dull, a bit dry when it comes to the small grains and the. So I think you've hit on some interesting
some sorghum noodles or some bean noodles,
Yeah.
or millet noodles.
Well, sorghum rice has huge potential. Everyone in Gokwe wants to eat rice. It's insane. They have huge trucks pulling up with South African GMO rice, which they sell in Gokwe, and it goes like wildfire. So why can't we have sorghum rice? Sorghum can be cooked exactly the same way as rice, much more convenient than making sadza. Make sorghum rice exciting for the community. And it grows well in Gokwe.
Okay, I think, Michael, we can open the floor. We can. Anything else you want to add to your quickly on your presentation? Something you've forgotten that you wanted to say that you hadn't said?
I just wanted to say that the difficulty with commercializing everything is that we've got to remember that people have got no money in Gokwe. So if you commercialize too much, then you commercialize it out of the community, and then you just end up sucking the food back into the national market. So you've got to find a really clever way of doing it so that you keep it in Gokwe. And maybe part of it is like developing local processing enterprises that manufacture things, but that part of the payment is in product that stays in Gokwe or something. I don't know. You're marketing people, you're clever. But it's got to be done very carefully.
Okay.
So I don't have any questions for any of the panelists. So Alex,
Go first and then send you the mic. Yeah, Godfrey.
Yes, I've got many questions.
Many.
But we speak of youth. I think sometimes our definition and understanding of youth needs more elaboration. If we go to rural areas, who is youth? If you get, and now I think it's right for you to be married at 20, have children who are going to ECD and so forth, and you are not yet certified. You are a youth. So sometimes when we talk of these youth, we are referring to these 18-year-olds, teens. I think our focus is these youthful matters or couples. Yes. They are the ones that need maybe your nutrition education. They are the ones who are actually interested in the demand, because they have to take care of these growing babies, children, school going and so forth. And they also are putting something in the land, in the rural areas for people to take. Are they taking nutritious snacks? So when we talk of interventions, to me, this is where the focus needs to be. Now, that particular 23-year-old mother does not have enough time. And what is it that you're going to do? To prepare this food. Walk 5 kilometers to go and get firewood to come and cook. So these are the issues that need to be looked at. And also talking about that, when you looked at the institutions that are there, you don't find rural development. You find architects. Architects, it's all now when we now have rural development in architects. I think the permanent secretary made rural development part of architects. There was no rural development. What you have agriculture. And our agriculture is growing to sell. Farming as a business. And I think that. So there is this element of rural development where you bring all these food systems as part of your rural development. Is to me is the missing thing in I was going to say in our agriculture. And that's what is needed. And when you talk of rural development, it has to go beyond agriculture, food systems. I think that's what we need to move towards. Urban areas, who had the problem? You look at youth. Yeah, I think our urban area youth go to urban children who don't have money to do anything. But if they find money, they'll go to the next food outlet and buy sliced chicken. So again, we now need to, where is it that we need to do to address the situation? Yes, this food system approach, I think, is the way to go.
Yeah.
And again, the issue of energy becomes an issue. And what is our energy right now? I think it's dominated by LP gas, wood, and wood. We just need to make these things available and affordable. They are just becoming expensive. And you know from the urban agriculture studies, species. Do you grow food or do you put a cabin to earn income from tenants? I think that's the choices that people are having. Now the question is, if you now get income from tenants, what do you use the income for? Do you use it for improved food security, nutrition? So there's, I think, major issues that needs to be looked at.
Okay. Do you want to respond?
I just think it's good that Godfrey's highlighted young families because in this country we classify youth as 35 and under. It definitely includes that young family group. And I think we don't give it enough attention in our agricultural policy, especially when we talk about youth, because we think about 17, 18-year-olds and not the young families, who are the ones who have very little land, often, especially if land is short in Gokwe North, then that it'll be those people who don't have a lot of land.
And I on a recent trip to Matabeleland South, which I think it's similar in many respects to Gokwe, I was shocked at the lack of young people. I went to a school, and the school kids were there, and then they introduced us to the school board, and they were all old.
Oh, yeah.
The parents were not there. It was the grandparents who were there. So there's a huge missing in the rural, huge missing strata of the youth up to 35 that you're talking about. And so when we're talking about agriculture, there's a huge crisis of labour and that's there. And I mean, I don't know what we can do about that, but it's a real critical problem, and the future is going to be bleak, I think.
So some of the households in Bite Bridge said the positive thing about COVID is that their youth were back from South Africa and could participate in agriculture. just as a
Maybe so.
one of the studies we have done
Benefits.
there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, so just a question for Anna. Sandy Roberts here. Great to see you still involved in nutrition. Well done. You mentioned on one of your slides about there being pollution in air, water, and soil. What exactly were you referring to as pollution in that situation?
So in Gokwe, I think it begins with pesticides. Because it's a former cotton growing area, they've got some major super pests because they've all become resistant to all the chemicals that have been used there for, so many years. So pesticides is the start. Then there's also a lot of pollution from mining, from artisanal mining into the water systems. Processing, there's a bit of pollution, but it's really those are the major sources.
Maybe I can add, we got some chili tested recently also from a producer in Gokwe, and they've found DDT in it.
So that's from malaria spray.
Yeah, exactly.
Systems,
So
yeah.
you have, and quite a number of other pesticides were found in these chilies.
So
where did you get the chilies tested? Who tested those for you?
We got them tested in Europe and Germany actually.
it's a real problem, the indoor residual spraying, which is still going on. And a lot of people store their produce in their houses where the DDT is being sprayed, so that it all gets contaminated.
I think you were next. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much. I have two questions, one for Anna. And you talked about the crops that are being grown in Gokwe North and Gokwe South, and you said probably maize is not an ideal crop that could be grown in Gokwe South. From your analysis, what kind of crops can be grown in those two districts so that the farmers can make money? And in one of your presentations, you did say in the Midlands province, Gokwe South and North, I have low income. And obviously, these farmers are growing to make some kind of income, and then I say, if we are to work with them, what kind of crops are ideal for those two districts? And for Dr. Atoliro, the food systems, you see, it looks like a discussion is for the rich guys. Because when you're a poor guy, you don't have a choice. You eat what is available. So I don't know in terms of what is it that could be done to make sure that we raise the poverty levels to such an extent that they can make a choice. Because if I have no money, I eat what is available. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of crops, I think what's really important is for people to diversify. I don't think people should be swapping maize for another single crop, but I think they really need to start diversifying. And of course, one of the main reasons people grow maize, apart from the fact that it's the preferred food for everybody, is that there's a guaranteed market for maize. So they take this massive gamble in that even they know their crop might fail, but it might survive, and then they're guaranteed to get an income from it. So this is why we have to take a food system approach. If we were just taking an agriculture approach, then we'd just think, what crop should we replace maize with? But taking a food system approach, we have to think, how can we change the market so that there's a demand for a wider range of different crops? How can we make sure that people get income from growing a wider range of different crops? And then gradually get people to switch to a diverse range of different crops. I think that's what's important. Sesame has been tried in Gokwe. I believe it does grow well, but it's a market. I believe it's a market issue, and a lot of the confectionery industry is still importing sesame from Mozambique when we could be growing it in Zimbabwe. So I think this is a really good illustration of why a food system approach needs to be taken.
And it's also the how to grow. It's not only the what, but then also the how.
Can I just add something? That I think there's an overemphasis on crops, particularly for Gokwe. One thing which surprised me a little bit about your study is you said very little about livestock. And I was actually surprised looking at some of the Zimbabwe data at the low level of livestock ownership in Gokwe. Not so much the cattle, because that's pretty typical, but the fact that more than half the families don't have goats, and the similar for chickens. So I think one of the things which has to be looked at in a lot more detail is the livestock, because in most other areas, your livestock becomes your savings, which you then use to finance your agri-processing or your petty trading or something else. So particularly, I think for Gokwe, I think there needs to be a lot more talk about small ruminants, goats, backyard chickens. Yes, protect your cattle, but more for the poorest groups is to focus on that livestock, because then I think you overcome some of the financial issues, because livestock are basically financial instruments in rural areas. You said it yourself. That's what people swap when they go to a supermarket or go to a retail shop. They want to swap their grain, their chickens, their goats for other things. I think a lot more emphasis on livestock and less on crop production would help.
So you do indicate that poverty is a big issue in urban food systems and we need to deal with it. That's correct. We need to identify ways of improving livelihoods for the urban households. But the starting point from my observations is, let's recognize these people's food systems currently. At the moment, their food systems are precarious because they are criminalized. So we could start there. We recognize their food systems, and then, as of course, the economy can be worked on, but I think it's a much bigger problem. But recognizing their food systems, we can do that immediately.
Take that, gentleman.
Mine is a contribution and a question. My first contribution is on the issue of the choice of fast foods and health food. I think the war, my opinion is the war that we're facing here globally is that there's been a lot of investments in fast foods companies or fast foods industries. And we talk of the McDonald's, we talk of the KFCs, we talk of the Inscores in Zimbabwe, for example. These are the people who are producing fast foods, and I don't think they would want to see the investment going to West, and they will actually make them cheaper and affordable and more accessible. No wonder why in your distribution network, you showed 92 outlets for Insco. That speaks volumes. So the question may not be on affordability or awareness, but maybe deliberate effort by government to facilitate investment, perhaps, or influence these investors who are the big outlets, existing outlets, to foster probably some health food or health eating. So that's my contribution. The second one is a question. It's on sesame. I heard you talked about sesame. It's also interesting that companies here are importing sesame. But when you look at it, I've been in Mpumbura, Checheche, the sesame growing areas. You see, the Mozambicans are actually coming informally to buy sesame from Zimbabwe. Then they ship it to Mozambique. So, so it's that weird to see our local companies going to Mozambique, then import the sesame. I don't know where the market is. We are missing it. But like there's a market. Maybe from your study, you may actually never look to what is the missing link. I'm much interested.
We didn't really look at that. I just threw that in. I mean, Michael knows more about the sesame story than anyone, I'm sure. So I'll throw it to you.
Okay, so we were involved in a project in Gulf South since around about 2016, promoting sesame. We worked through the private sector, a particular company that was buying it and then shipping it to Mozambique. The sesame is apparently a climate smart crop in that it can withstand dry conditions. The yields were pretty disappointing. I think we had one bumper year, and that's when all the side marketers came in and bought the crop from under the sponsoring company's feet, so to say. But the other years, if you get a dry spell when the crop is germinating, nothing's really going to germinate. And I think that's what happened for a couple of years. And then we had La Nina, and it does not like water, too much water. So it was a commercial failure. the company that was promoting it sort of left. Subsequently, I think Codco took it up. I think they were promoting it, especially in the northern districts of the country. I'm not sure how that worked. I haven't heard much about it, so I'm assuming it didn't work very well. Otherwise, we would see an expansion of it. So what I've said about assessing it may be a bit negative. I do think there's scope for it, but particularly if government takes it up and supports it, or the likes of TRB. Yeah.
We are actually considering sesame as one of the.
So we can have a bilateral. I can give you some results and maybe put a gem on the problem.
Thank you.
What do you mean? This is too far away. Sorry about that. Sorry.
My question is, I think it's largely focusing on the Hivos study or the research that you guys did. I don't understand. I get that food systems is very broad, but there's one aspect of food system that I feel it's very crucial when you're talking about transforming the informal markets. Like you mentioned already, they all need to be recognized. So I wanted to find out from the research, has there been any indication of a platform where the informal market or the informal stakeholders have had any dialogues with the councils? Or is it something that we can think of within our future projects? Or is it still a volatile environment to discuss policy changes or creating a more conducive environment for the informal markets? Because I feel that is one key food system transformation area that we also need to think of.
Yeah, so in terms of timing, no, the time is now that we should be talking about informal food systems as well. We have a good example already in Bulawayo where it is working, there is engagement. Sadly, here it's not working as well. In fact, it's horrible. I did my PhD was on the relationship between spatial planning and urban food systems, and my study area was airports. And I also concluded that 90% of all shops, butcheries, grinding mills in airport are illegal. So the time to engage on that is now, because it's affecting so many people. And just to put into perspective, Epworth is the third largest urban settlement in Zimbabwe by population. It's now nearing 300,000 residents in that area. So you can imagine if we are not meeting, if we are not addressing the needs of 300,000 people, I think it's such a disservice. They are buying from butcheries that are not recognized, from grocery shops that are not recognized. There are very few shopping centers in airport. In fact, it is the only urban area in this country where there is no supermarket. In airport, the whole of airport, 300,000 people, no supermarket, not a single one. So we need to be working on the informal sector. We need to be engaging with them. And part of my conclusion is we really are doing a disservice because we are totally ignoring these people's lived experience. They are living in there. People have been born in airport, they are now adults. The situation has not changed. But we continue to criminalize their livelihoods. That is their life. It's either we do something about it or we allow them to live their lives. So I agree totally with you that we need to do something about informal food systems because they support the bulk of the people in poor neighborhoods.
So, Percy, you mentioned we need to do something about it. We who is we?
When I say we, I'm just being collective and not wanting to apportion blame. And by that we, I mean local governments, councils, they are the custodians of the regulations. But we need to push them also as communities. Sometimes they're not seeing what is affecting us. We want to push them. And you know, I even, there's a concept called cognitive dissonance, where you don't see what is, what you are seeing is really, you don't see what is there. You see what you want to see. Even products of informality in this country. I have met with planners who were brought up by mothers who sold at the markets, informal markets, who when they become planners, suddenly it's illegal for anyone to sell vegetables in the streets. You know, so there's also very much, I am pretty much emotional about these issues because I live them. At some point I was part of them because when I left the city of Harare, I was the head of town planning. And I used to have planners who would go and demolish people's livelihoods. But, you know, I've also now come, when you appreciate cities more and the different stakeholders that live in cities, and you go even into concepts like the right to city and so on, you don't realize there are some people that we are not giving a voice. They are there, they are not there. We see them just as objects and are not helping them. So when I say we, I'm saying collectively, we all have something to do about this.
But thinking on my toes here, are councils not made out of councillors? And are councillors not representing certain constituencies? So should the lobby not be with councillors who then meet at a higher level to try and influence policy?
So they are part of the we in my argument.
Okay.
Councillors, because they also represent people. But you know, representation is also problematic in its own way. It's not all of us who are represented. You know, many of us have issues that we feel should be priority issues, but are not priority issues. But I mean, I would be happy to hear what others think.
Yeah, but I think it's this systemic thinking which is behind the food systems approach and food system transformation. And I think this must be kind of acknowledged and embraced as well, that we all are part of this food system. And if we want to transfer it, we all have a responsibility. And of course, I mean, looking back at the countrywide food systems analysis which was done, and which had a lot of stakeholders involved. It was not just Alex and Anna who did it. There were many stakeholders who then also presented this at the Food Summit. And they should be held accountable if we want to transform the food system. This is systemic thinking which is behind. And if you work with this food system, then you have to be accountable, and this is each and every one. It's complex. It appears very complicated, but this is the theory.
But making the responsibility for everyone doesn't really give a driving force.
Of course, we need to then also identify the drivers, but first of all, it needs this acknowledgement of everyone that we are all part of this.
I want to give a question at the back. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I just had a couple of contributions. But one thing that struck my mind was on the issue that I'm thinking now, the indigenous knowledge system. To what extent is it contributing now to the improvement of data divides? Because I remember when we used to go to the rural areas visiting, maybe over Christmas or something like this, the first thing that would go there with was jam, margarine, and so forth and so on. But when we got there, one thing that my grandmother would do was a nice meal for us, which was made of pumpkin mixed with peanut butter and so forth. And this was more of traditional. And this was also more of nutritious. But that, to me now, that knowledge, that indigenous knowledge, that was there. I don't see it, coming up now. And this is also actually, I think, in my view, have contributed to the lack of better nutrition in diets that we now encompass, that we assist with. So that's number one. Then number two, I think I like the studies on the Gokwe North and South. I also once did a study there, looking at the crop commercialization, and I was looking at the effects of cotton commercialization on nutrition, on incomes, and does increase the incomes from the cotton commercialization improve, result in better nutrition? And when I looked at that, it was more of the other way. Those who did not commercialize actually had better nutrition outcomes, and those who were getting better incomes from the cotton actually had poor nutrition and diets. And my conclusion there was actually, I think there is a missing link in terms of the income contribution to the nutrition and diets. And then now I also hear now that what is coming that cotton is more of people in Gokwe, they are now more moving away from the cotton and probably specializing more on the horticulture and the food crop, production and commercialization. And what they do then is to much more focused on the market in the hope that they will get an increased outcome, but increased income. But that again is not translating to the better improved nutrition in terms of the food systems that we are getting. So I think even when we look at the urban areas, the increased population is highlighted. There are reduced spaces for where people can go and do their farming, because now the pressure is on. But at the same time, we now see the increased proliferation of these informal markets, which are actually bringing in food from South Africa and highly processed foods. And what is available to us is the highly processed. But at the same time, I would like to believe the issue of social behavior change, and the knowledge about how best can we infuse the indigenous knowledge systems into helping the young mothers to understand that soccer rice is actually much better than the processed rice. So I think those are my contributions.
Thank you for the contributions. Would anyone like to respond to
I can take indigenous knowledge. In fact, I think all of your contributions are totally intermeshed. And I think that the indigenous knowledge issue is a really important one for Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, indigenous knowledge has been completely smashed, first by colonialism, and I also recently discovered that the church has played a huge role in undermining the dissemination of traditional knowledge and the power of traditional leaders. So it's a very, very complex issue. And I mean, the long and short of it is that young people have turned their back on indigenous knowledge. And this is quite an unusual thing about Zimbabwe, because I think that Regina will confirm that in Asia, people are actually very proud of their traditional food, but their real traditional food. And there's a national pride about that aspect of indigenous culture. Whereas in Zimbabwe, unfortunately, that has been completely smashed by colonialism and globalization. It still exists. But I think what we need to do is not try and expect young people to go back to indigenous knowledge, but to take the valuable aspects of indigenous knowledge and merge them into modern society and modern culture and make them palatable for young people. And I think that's really the only way we can use indigenous knowledge meaningfully in this context. And then that other thing of food is not food when you grow it, it's money. So it's that mentality, it's the commodification of food. Food is a commodity, it's not something that you use to improve your health. And that is a really difficult mentality to change, but you're not going to change people by telling them this contains vitamin A and this contains vitamin B. You have to change people's perceptions of themselves and what they value about themselves. Unfortunately, it takes a very long time to do that.
And it's reflected in the evidence study, the lack of indigenous knowledge systems, that people generally no longer know how to prepare certain foodstuffs. So we're losing it both ways.
Yeah, I like what you were saying, and I think I like talking about how we can decolonize the food system. It's something I'm still exploring, but I think it's about changing the narrative, and that's behavior change, and that's one of the most complex areas of development because human beings are complex. But I wanted to go back to the comment about who's responsible, and obviously the government is key, but we have to work with them. And we have to shine a light together on the issues, because there are two things that still, when I think about them, my blood boils, that our Ministry of Health imported all these tons of DDT. And I bet you, if you go to the communities and say, were you told the risks? And they were told it's fine, it'll be safe. It's a shiny Western thing coming. Do you want malaria? No, then have this. Were you told about cancer? Is it a choice and informed? So that was about 10 years ago, or something recent. This was
going on since the 70s.
And, yes, and yet it's been banned all around the world. So Africa is a dumping ground for things that have been banned all over. And I just want to mention glyphosate quickly, because that is, someone said to me, glyphosate is now the most commonly used pesticide. That terrifies me. Glyphosate is being banned in the EU, will ban it. Some countries, it was Germany that blocked that, by the way. So there wasn't an EU ban, but individual countries are going ahead, and then probably when the next voting, it will be banned. But maybe. But glyphosate, if that is the number, if that's true, and I want to do some research, that is terrifying. It's very easy if you can research.
It's cancer.
It is cancer causing. And if you look at what's happened in America, which I always look of as the apocalypse, that's not where we want to go. And the path we are on, that is where we are going. But we know there's been millions of dollars awarded in damages to people who have had cancer from that product. Why are we importing it here? Has there been a consultation? Do people know? So we have to work together on that. And we have done, by the way, some research.
Justified because it's making life for farmers easier, particularly female farmers, because they don't have the time for all the weeding.
But do they know?
They don't. I fully agree with you.
They don't know.
The justification of these killer arguments, which we can.
And another thing, the Ministry of Health, fortifying sugar, the cause of cancer and diabetes with vitamin A. So all I can think of is who got a nice contract to import vitamin A. I don't know. Anyway, it makes me mad. But we have to work with together, everybody, shining a light on the issues, public consultations, agenda setting together, and then. Yeah.
Thank you, Gigi. I think there are more comments there than questions, but any response?
Value chains. Everything that we are facing in terms of regulations. I'm asking because we actually have a youth program, and we've actually been struggling to promote youth employment in the urban areas. Our numbers have been quite low because I think because of lack of access to land. So whatever you're promoting under agriculture, even if it's processing, they do not have even the facilities they want to process. They need the industrial areas, which may be prohibited because of the rental prices. So what then maybe is left is maybe the home industry side where they can do. So we've actually been battling to find out what we can promote as youth enterprises for something around agriculture.
Yeah, but the options are many, because in our findings, almost everyone is just growing leaf vegetables, red, chomolia, covo. And yet they could also do carrots, they could do beans, they could do many other options. Because the leaf vegetables, although very popular, they're not necessarily the most nutritious. you would also, or at least you would want them together with other, types of vegetables. But I would quickly think of, beans, highly nutritious, high protein content, carrots, lots of vitamins and so on. I mean, we could engage more regarding what we have also developed. What we did some 12 years ago with Anna, we did develop materials at MDP, which are materials which can be used in low input gardens and so on, where there is very minimal use of fertilizer, very environmentally, ecologically sensitive growing, but also very much linked with the market. And so we have some useful materials that we could share.
So I think we better draw this to an end. Timekeeping's been horrendous. I don't know if there's any final words from our panelists. No? Okay, so maybe I'll just sort of round up. I think a big take home for me is the high percentage of youth in the urban areas. Did you say 60% of 60% youth in urban areas?
Yeah, that's our population is very much a young population.
So I think that should be a big influence on programming in the future. Yeah. Another thing that wasn't really brought up, we heard time and time again about the commercialization of indigenous foods. A few years ago, we were involved in the setup of the Traditional Grain Processors Association, and I think you might have met with them. But the members there are Cairns and Delta and National Foods and some of the smaller ones. I saw Ubuntu Foods' products on one of the slide, so they're also members. But one of the things that they were going to do, unfortunately, it's been a bit of a stillbirth, but hopefully it's going to grow some feet, was to do a national campaign on traditional grains, which could, I guess, be extended to other traditional food types. But certainly to get the public mind more in tune with what is healthy and what is good. I really like what you said about pre-cooking beans. That's very practical. So it can come at all different levels, and I think maybe there needs to be some sort of working group established on food systems to maybe brainstorm around some of these ideas and maybe try and get some funding in the right directions. Anyway, thanks very much for the great attendance. A really fascinating topic. So thank you to our panelists, Jane, Anna, Percy. Thank you for your time and sort of the thought that you've put into this afternoon's events. So a round of applause for our panelists.